If you're building your no-code app on Bubble, the database is one of the first and most important components that you'll need to address. In this video, we're going to go over everything you need to know about building your app's database so that you can kick off development with a strong start. Let's start by getting oriented with the key areas of a Bubble app database. Data types are your tables. Every Bubble app comes with a built-in data type called user, which is where all of your user accounts are organized, and you can create additional custom types to suit your own needs. Fields are created inside of the data type to store properties about the record. For example, a text field for a user's name or an image field for a company's logo. Option sets are a predetermined list of choices, and you can create as many of these as you'd like. For example, a list of statuses or a list of categories. As we'll see very soon, there are no templates or shortcuts in this area of the Bubble editor. It is up to you to create the data types, fields, and option sets custom to support the data you want to organize, as well as to support any specific functions you need in the app to make things more interactive. And this is a great thing because it means that you're not going to be boxed into a limited structure. Instead, you'll have full control over how you want your app to work. Let's take a closer look at data types. You can think of data types like folders for your data sets that will help you keep everything organized. And every app's list of data types is going to look different. Now remember, every Bubble app comes with a built-in data type called user. This is because there are some special built-in capabilities with user records that Bubble will handle for you regarding credentials and keeping users unique. But if we were to build a marketplace app like Airbnb, for example, here are some additional data types that we'd expect to create: listing, transaction, and review. Or how about a project management app like Notion? We might find these custom data types as well: project, task, comment, document. What about an app for personal fitness tracking like MyFitnessPal? We could have activity, log, goal, progress photo, and meal. Scheduling apps like Calendly are really popular on Bubble, so for anything involving bookings or appointments, we usually see these data types: daily availability, blocked dates, and bookings. We can't forget social networks, which are very user-powered and typically conversation-heavy. With these apps like Facebook or Reddit, we might find private thread, message, forum category, forum post, forum comment. And these are just the baseline types that you'd want to create for those types of apps. There are, of course, many other categories of data that you may come across depending on your feature set. Now, if you're having trouble figuring out how to break down your database into distinct and unique data types, think about the most important nouns that you may encounter when describing your app's most vital functions. For example, in a fitness tracking app, I want users to create a daily log of their fitness and nutrition activity so they can meet their wellness goals. In a project management app, I want teams to set up projects with tasks that they can assign to other users in order to accomplish milestones. Usually these nouns will be a good indicator of when you need to separate data types for them. And performance-wise in Bubble, it is better to break down your database into more smaller types, meaning data types with less fields in them, than having fewer but bigger types with more fields. There are many things to balance, of course, but this is a good rule of thumb. Also, data types don't have to be just for records that your users are going to create. It can also be how you organized information that is app provided. So let's say, for example, you're creating a custom training portal. You, as the app builder and content creator, are going to set up the data types and the records for things like learning resources, modules or chapters, the lessons, all of the content that your users are actually going to go through. While your users, on the other hand, may be creating notes or quiz responses. They may be generating some progress tracking behind the scenes as they make their way through. So your database can really be a mix of both types of content. Now it's time to add fields to them. Let's take a look at a simple example within the built-in user type. If your app is one where users are creating accounts, then you'll want to create a field for every detail you want to save about the user. For example, first name, last name, profile picture, short bio. The fields you create here are completely up to you. Just remember that with the user type specifically, Bubble will already have built-in fields for email and password handled for you, so you don't need to create those again. When you set up a field in Bubble, you'll need to choose the format of the field. This matters because it dictates what kind of logic you can perform with that field's value. For example, if you added a sales tax field in a transaction data type as a text, you wouldn't be able to do math with it. Well, technically you could with some manipulations, but don't make things harder for yourself. A number format is going to be more appropriate for this particular use case compared to a text. Here are some other fields we might add to the transaction data type. Subtotal, discounts, and totals would all be number fields. Maybe a customer address field set up as a geographic location if the transaction is related to, let's say, a shipment. You could have a yes/no field called paid to very simply indicate whether the transaction is still pending or not. And what about fields for the project management app? The task data type could have fields for title, description, due date, completion date. If you think of a traditional table in a spreadsheet, fields represent your columns. In fact, once you start creating records, you'll see Bubble present that data to you in this exact format under the App Data tab. Your fields describe the record. So a user's name, a user's photo, or a transaction status or a transaction's amount. Try to come up with the fields that you know you're going to need right out of the gate. You'll find that as you move through development, you'll encounter new fields that are necessary that you can always add in later. That's okay. That's actually very, very normal. Not everything is going to be obvious at the start. So don't paralyze yourself trying to come up with everything, making things perfect from the beginning. All you need is a baseline to get going. Now, let's move into option sets. These should be relatively easy to put together. Again, option sets are simply predetermined lists of choices. These lists can be used in your designs for your users to make selections, such as marital status when creating a profile, or they can serve a more supporting role behind the scenes, such as organizing various user permission types like system admin, company admin, employee, and guest. Go ahead and set up all of the sets that you can think of from the start and add all of the options within them. Just keep in mind that option sets can only be managed by an app editor, so you're not storing any user-specific data here. These are static lists. Option sets are also best for smaller lists, I would say under a couple dozen choices or so, and they're also best for lists that aren't going to change very often. An option set for days of the week, for example, is a perfect use case because the days of the week are always the same and there's only 7 of them. Note that option sets are not technically a part of your app's database. They'll certainly be referenced by data fields, but structurally they are their own type of app asset that are more baked into your app's architecture. All right, you've set up your core database components, data types, fields, and option sets. Let's connect these things together and open up more doors with relationships. Relating records to one another allows you to not just stay more organized, but also keep things more efficient. Aside from specific edge cases, you shouldn't need to be redundant in your data structure, where you're duplicating information across multiple records. In fact, you shouldn't want to do that because it can leave more room for error. Instead, what you want to do is link records to one another so that you can create more helpful information pathways. Creating a relationship in Bubble happens at the field level. In a marketplace app, for example, it would be helpful to know the buyer and seller involved in a transaction. So the transaction data type could have 2 fields that each relate to the user type. You see that? Instead of formatting this field as a plain text, we'll select the user data type. This creates a relationship between the transaction record and an entire user record that allows you to get to all information within that user record, the user's email, their name, things like that. So by selecting a data type as the field format, this is how you can create links between records. And it doesn't matter if the data types match. You can mix and match these relationship types. Here's another example. Let's add a relationship to the listing data type. So when it's time to create a transaction record, we can reference a specific listing record to know what the payment was for. The actual mechanism for specifying the linked records will happen in your workflows, but your first step is to set up the structure to support that logic, okay? So just remember at this stage, you're setting up the architecture that in general, a transaction needs to be tied to a buyer, a seller, and a listing. In our project management app, we can relate a task to a user as a way of identifying who this task is assigned to. It's just another example there. Note that this is also how you set up fields in your data types to reference option sets. For example, if you had a set for transaction status, you can create a new field in the transaction data type that is not a text, but instead formatted as the status option set. Now, when a transaction record is created, the value for this field is limited to one of these status choices. Next, let's talk about lists. Lists in your data structure allow you to create one-to-many relationships as well as many-to-many relationships. For example, a project could have multiple tasks associated with it. A team could have multiple team members, an order could have multiple line items, and a blog post could have multiple keywords associated. Lists are also defined at the field level. All you need to do is check the box that says you want to allow multiple values for that field. Now, here are some things to know about list fields. First, Bubble has a hard limit of 10,000 items in a single record's list field. And you really shouldn't be going anywhere near that number if you care about your app's performance. We actually like to limit to around 100 items. There's a balance here, and every app is different, but if the weight of your list data is on the heavier end, like a list of high resolution images, bigger or heavier lists like this can really slow down your search and loading speeds. So you're going to want to limit how many items you put in the list and maybe even make a decision to not have the list altogether. There are alternatives to relating your records and content in other ways. If your lists are more contained, they can help you create efficient shortcuts to data without needing to perform a full-blown database search to find them. Searches can cost more in terms of workload unit consumption. Generally, lists are more efficient if you're not needing to manipulate them when you're referencing them in your logic. So, for example, if you're having to add more complex filters to the list, you might actually be better off performing a database search instead. Again, like I said, this is an area where things aren't necessarily black and white. Every app is different. You'll need to balance these components for your app specifically. Now, let's say that you have a list field that is tied to other records, so it's not just a list of plain text or numbers or dates. Then you'll want to consider adding the relationship on the other end, on the other record as well. Here are a few different scenarios. So in our example of an order or an invoice having multiple line items, that's a one-to-many relationship, right? You could go back to the line item and tie it back to its parent order. So that would be the one-to-one relationship there. So we know that we have the parent to child and child back to parent. Another scenario is team members and projects, and you can create a many-to-many situation here. So let's say a project can have a relationship to a list of users, so those are the team members on the project. But then on the other side, every team member can be a part of multiple projects. And because both sides have list relationships, that's essentially creating your many-to-many scenario. Alternatively, for the many-to-many, you could have a completely separate data type, right? You can think of this as sort of a join record that is made up of one-to-one relationships. So a separate record that links a specific team member to a specific project. And if there is another project that the team member is on, that is another record. And the list scenario here is really the list of records that are created, but it's a list of records with one-to-one relationships within them. Hey, real quick, if you're finding this helpful, we've put together a complete guide to help you figure out if Bubble is right for your app. You can check it out over at coachingnocodeapps.com/bubble-guide, and I've also put a link in the description below. As you can see, this guide walks through everything from pricing to performance, IP ownership, and more. Head to coachingnocodeapps.com/bubble-guide to get immediate access. Now that you have your data structure going, you'll want to be mindful of a few settings and concepts to help support that structure. First, user roles. Many applications across a variety of industries will need to create some kind of user role system to identify permissions. I recommend setting up an option set for the possible roles and then relating that to your user type. From here, you can reference a user's role to help you create conditions in your workflows and designs. For example, a company admin may have access to billing functions in your design, whereas those functions are hidden from users with the role of employee or guest. You can also use data types to let your users set up their own roles with custom labels. This is more common with SaaS structures and generally requires a little bit more logic to come together, but all the components you need are absolutely there to make it happen. Next, privacy and security of your app's data. Don't sleep on this part of your app's design. It is your responsibility to protect your users' data because you are creating the structure in a custom way. Bubble can't know how to create privacy rules around that custom structure. It's not going to be able to assume things for you. So make sure that you are addressing and testing these areas early and often. Your first stop should be the Privacy Rules sub-tab within the Data section of your app's editor. Privacy rules are created to help you restrict access to records app-wide, and they're created per data type so that you can get really granular with your custom rules. In some cases, you may not need to set up any rules if the content isn't sensitive. For example, let's say that you have a data type of countries to organize names, flags, currencies, and so on. None of that is private information, so there's no need to create a rule here. Conversely, a data type for contracts may hold more sensitive information that only the parties involved in the contract should have access to. So when you set up a rule or multiple rules, we recommend approaching them from the granting access perspective. Anyone who doesn't meet any of the rules would therefore be restricted from accessing them. Privacy rules require a well-organized data structure so that you can set up conditions based on who the user is and/or what their relationship is to the user in question. Now, aside from privacy rules, your data structure will also help you create specific filters in your dynamic expressions. Every data-driven app at one point or another is going to have a database search somewhere in its logic. A search expression comes with optional filter and sort settings that you can add to refine those search results. The settings are very dependent on what fields are available in the data type and the format of those fields. So when it comes to security, search constraints can help you filter out data that the user isn't allowed to access alongside your privacy rules. If you plan on connecting your Bubble application to third-party systems, then you may need to expose your app's APIs. Now, this is something that you intentionally need to turn on in your settings, but if you do enable this, then you are exposing more of your application to the outside world. So it is really important that you check all of your configurations, your privacy rules, so that you are limiting access, especially to your database, to only those who should have it. Speaking of integrations, you may need to add additional data types and fields to help support those connections to other systems. For example, if your users are importing data via CSV or through an automation, you might want to dedicate a data type to first save the imported data unmanipulated and then kick off other workflows to clean up values, perform calculations, parse out to other tables, and so on. Or if you're integrating with a specific service, you may need text fields to save important IDs. For example, an integration with a payment gateway like Stripe usually involves referencing a variety of IDs for subscriptions, invoices, customers, charges, and more. Once your database is defined, you can now start to create test data and see your structure come to life. I suggest starting with simple manual entries in the App Data tab of your editor. Create a few records in each of your types to see some variety. The key word here is a few records. You will inevitably find some holes in your initial structure and need to make adjustments, which may render some initial test records unusable. So save yourself the back and forth of deleting and recreating a bunch of records by starting small. Too often I see folks get really excited and upload an initial CSV with like thousands of records only to discover that they were missing, let's say an important relationship field. And so now they're forced to delete all of those records. Don't forget that creating a record does cost half a workload unit, and that can add up very quickly if you're doing a big import of a CSV, for example. So try not to get too ahead of yourself so that you can be strategic with your workload consumption. For manual entries, relationship fields can be a little tricky because there can be a bit of a chicken or the egg scenario. So you may need to create records without relationships first so that they exist in the database, and then you can go back and modify those records to fill in the relationship. Normally, you'll handle the definition of the relationships in a workflow so that things are more automated for you. That would be the kind of real world scenario that your users will actually experience. But just remember that Bubble is not going to auto-link anything for you. It is up to you to set those values on both sides of the relationship. After you've seen some of your test data fill in the context of your data structure, you can now move on to designing forms, tables, action buttons on your pages, and then building workflows that reference those designs so that you can create, read, update, and delete your database entries. Finally, if there's anything you want to get in the habit of doing early on, it's having a clear labeling system. Whether you're building your app solo or if you're working with other people, having a consistent and organized labeling system for those data types, fields, and option sets, it's going to make a huge difference in your development. Make sure your data type names are in the singular format. The type represents a single record, and Bubble will know to pluralize that name for you wherever appropriate. Keep your labels concise and as literal as possible. You're going to see that labels are referenced everywhere in your dynamic expressions, so the shorter the name, the more legible things will be. Help yourself identify list fields and relationship fields with consistent prefixes. I like to use the words list of XYZ and related XYZ for these. You can also use emojis here. I love inserting emojis into these labels because it can really change the way everything is sorted in the Bubble editor. Bubble's natural sort order is alphabetical, but if you put the same emoji in front of related types or fields, then those will stay together and can make it easier for you to navigate your own structure. All right, I hope this was helpful, and if it was, the content you're about to see on the screen next will help you take things even further.